Welcome to State of the Hack. I'm Christopher Glyer.
And I'm Nick Carr.
And this show we've got our matching ugly sweaters, Game of Thrones theme.
We got a company Christmas party in just a little bit. So let's get right to it. Santa's joining us today too for our threat roundup. So we just wanted to talk about a little bit of the in the wild activity we're seeing. So behind us, if you're checking it out, we have just the activity, some of the most interesting activity around the company.
We've got some things, Iran pretty active, China fairly active, some Russian threat activity. What else we got?
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to call out was
Dad Joke. Dad
Joke, which is a code family that we've created, and we did a little bit of work on this malware family, Dad Joke.
Is it related to Dad Bod?
you read the reports. Actually, to read some interesting new research about it, Brian Bartholomew over at Kaspersky Labs did a presentation on it and has made the slides publicly available. So, check that out. But your average, a lot of espionage activity on the services and product side. China, Russia, and
of course, 41.
APT 41.
Loving the telco space.
Yeah, did we do I think that blog came out since our last episode on Message Tap, where they're targeting telco providers to...
Linux-based malware?
Yeah, Linux-based malware, targeting telco providers to read people's text messages for certain keywords and of certain people's phones. So really interesting, but we kind of talked about some of that in the APT 41 episode.
Show, yep.
But check that out. And then here they're just continuing to use some new malware families in coordination with publicly available tools. That sounds like a sensitive area. Maybe we won't talk about too much on the episode, or maybe we will.
Where's all the financial activity?
Aha, so we also have a clicker on this episode, which is why we're pretty far apart. So as a special treat, we'll just put up more stuff behind us visually. So this would be a good one, again, to check out the video on. So, yeah.
Lots of Fin7 activity. Super active, right?
Yes. So our Mandiant services team is spending a lot of time responding to Fin7. It seems to be a favorite group of ours. But this is, it's kind of... They spent all that time and retooled, and then we felt great about sort of pinning them up against a wall and knocking it out of the park as far as everything we could do. And we put out the blog about Mahalo Fin7, talking about their 6-month retooling and how we were able to kind of stop that and try to burn their infrastructure and all their tooling down by sharing that blog post. But obviously it's been really successful other places that come in, and we help them out with IR. So
yeah, I think a couple notable points is targeting past victims with phishing and other attacks against those victims, using victims' infrastructure to send spear phishing emails.
They're going back to a couple old tricks, some of the shim persistence.
Ooh, I love that one.
And we talked about that in our Fin7 SDB blog, and maybe a little bit of Carbonac.
Yeah.
I think the team was able to identify that C2 infrastructure prior to its use. Sort of interesting, but they swapped back to use Carbonac.
And then a few folks working on some financial cases released the blog this week. Dave Panian, Jake Nicastro talking about how to use actually every forensic investigator's, one of their core tools, Excel, of all things. I know I've used it pretty heavily in my background. I think, part of what the blog talked about, or at least what I liked about it, was showing how, when you're doing forensics, you never know what you're going to encounter in any particular environment, what kind of new log sources or other things. So you may not always have built-in parsers or other things that may make it pretty. And so you have to do with, make do with what you've got. And so Excel then, in those cases, is often very helpful with that. And so they gave examples about how
you created a financial attacker scenario and walked through those artifacts, right?
Exactly, right. How to actually blend them into a timeline using different formulas, or how to do time zone conversions automatically using some of the built-in formulas you've got in Excel, how to do visual analysis, so be able to take login information and showing, and be able to visually highlight either anomalous logins or other things like that. So great work, and for any incident responder, I would imagine Excel is probably a core tool that they use just for things like that.
Yeah, and I think I've certainly joked about it before, been critical of people's over-reliance on it as an analysis tool. But one of the things we run into on the Mandiant side is a lot of customers, that's a tool they have in their environment, obviously. So you can send them something that's formatted nicely that their teams can take and analyze and understand. So that's another reason why a lot of incident responders will use Excel, because their client deliverables they can share some technical analysis, and you know that they have the tooling in place, as opposed to internal SQL database tools that you're really using to do some of the power analysis.
Sure. So,
cool. Well, since we have this magical clicker and a little bit of space between us, which is, it's nice. I miss you over there. It's going all right. We thought we'd take the time to actually discuss a presentation we gave, a lightning talk we gave at Cyber WarCon, run by FireEye's John Holtquist here recently. So we gave this talk on Redsourcing.
Yep.
And there's interest, I think, from people in us just sending out the slides. We thought it might be better to talk through them and give some of the context.
I mean, it's a really nuanced discussion and debate, and we thought that being able to talk about it here would actually allow us to kind of discuss it in more length and detail. So, to be able to actually share and have that in a way that is hopefully authentic.
Yes, I feel like I'm walking on eggshells just talking about it. So when we gave the presentation at Cyber WarCon, the primary audience was like threat intel type teams and CTI and people that maybe honestly write off some of that tooling or focus a lot on really custom, really advanced things, and it's missing a larger part of the picture. So just keep that in mind as we walk through what we presented there and what we want to share with people. I would love some feedback on what people think about how we've represented that as well.
Sure.
Let's get it started. So we kind of described it as Redsourcing, like APT and Fin groups using or CNO operators using offensive security tooling or like outsourcing their evasion and tool creation to offensive security people. I stumbled through that already. That's not going to go great.
All right. So some of my background, I was, in college, I minored in economics and I really like, finance and have a real passion there. So one of the things that you learn in economics is like supply and demand curves. And so it's this concept that, there's a different shape depending on, and so Nick and I actually talked quite a bit. We're trying to think
Attackers think in graphs, Glyer thinks in curves.
Supply and demand curves.
Okay, sure.
So we dubbed it the cyber war curve, but we must have come up with like 15 different ways trying to represent visually kind of at least our thoughts on the data. And we thought that, a supply curve in this case actually represented fairly well what we were talking about. So from a resource and efficiency perspective, you basically have two different axes, right? So next slide. So if you look at like 10 years ago, and my background actually prior to working here, I did pen testing for 5 years at a Big Four consulting. So things were very different. This was 2004 to 2009. There were free tools that we leveraged, but we didn't, although we did internal pen tests, we go like physically to a client's location.
Pen tests. You guys didn't do red teaming because that as a concept didn't necessarily
exist. Right? So we didn't send spear phishing emails. We didn't use backdoor frameworks. We actually weren't allowed to use exploits. It was an internal limitation there.
So not necessarily full life cycle.
Full life cycle. We would physically go on site, with the client and plug in a laptop and then kind of go from there. So we would kind of assume that a user had been compromised and then. So that's kind of what we did then. So if you look, say starting 10 years ago, let's pretend that the bulk of, threat actors 10 years ago, they might have used some publicly available tools or red source tools like PW dump or LSA dump or things like that. Maybe Metasploit or Meterpreter. But since then, what we've seen is a pretty big shift in terms of the increase in number of tools.
Yeah, and so there's no surprise here when we're talking about adversary cost versus adversary capability. Cost, you're referring to just money and time, right?
It's time and money and resources, like aggregate spend. So, you would think that for more spend, you should be able to get more capability.
Yeah,
right?
This should not be surprising what we're describing right now. This is what was expected.
Yep. But, from a trend perspective, as we were thinking about it in the last 10 years, that curve has shifted, right? It shifted both its shape as well as its location. And so as more and more, as red teaming has become more of a broader discipline and there have been more publicly available tools and framework shared, what we've seen is, and I think it's very logical what we've seen actually on both sides, right? It's logical why red teams are sharing and releasing tools. It's also logical why threat actors are taking things that are, very effective and effectively free or very low cost for them, and incorporating them into their life cycle. So what does that mean? It means that for the same resources that you have, say you spent 10 years ago, you can be significantly higher up on the capability curve, or you can lower the cost or barrier to entry in terms of conducting an intrusion operation.
Perfect. So what we did in the presentation is walk through a couple examples closer to the cyber war perspective. I just want to say up front, APT32 represents this interesting model that we see other middle income and emerging country offensive capabilities emulating, where they sort of just rely on a single capability to do a lot of different things.
There's like one team
and that's
with a set of
lifted up.
capabilities, and they then deploy those capabilities in multiple ways, right?
Yeah, and and the point that we're going to walk through is how that's sort of lifted up by some of the red sourcing capabilities that allow these governments to conduct all kinds of activity. So we just provide a little bit of a background on the kinds of things that APT32 has done, monitoring dissidents, monitoring citizens, tracking journalists, law enforcement, corporate compliance and oversight in that other category. It's pretty loosely defined, and then some traditional espionage. On the spy stuff, remember, you don't need to buy stuff to do spy stuff, and if you want to learn about some of the APT32 spy stuff, there's an interesting article that I believe we've probably referenced before. I need to stop saying that because we rehash and highlight stuff we like a lot, but about APT32's intrusion into the Philippine government, taking classified phone records between President Duterte and President Trump. It's pretty interesting and spicy article there. A legitimate document that was later weaponized was actually released, and APT32 was behind it all. So kind of interesting, especially for those that track President Trump, phone log, phone transcript things that seem to be all the rage. Shout out to CrowdStrike. All right. So APT32's 2017 campaigns. What we really try to do here is highlight what we came forward when we saw this activity in 2017 and came forward with our APT32 promotion blog, talking about how we upgraded them into a full APT group and what they were doing then. And this is a look at some of the tool set that they were using. So they had their a whole suite of custom backdoors spanning a bunch of different protocols, Windshield, Soundbite, and For Real. As just some examples we talked about in the blog, Windshield being a TCP backdoor, Soundbite or Kaspersky's Dennis being a DNS backdoor, and then For Real being backdoor that I named. Funny story there for another time. That's an ICMP-based backdoor. And but really they very rarely use those things. And APT32 is really interesting. Part of the reason I talk about them a lot as the world's least authorized red team is they use a lot of red-sourced TTPs. Specifically for them, they use a lot from Twitter, and a lot of new just on keyboard techniques, and they spend their time doing custom evasion around those, putting their own spin on them. But every time they would meet some resistance and run into a defender catching them, they would shift and change, and a lot of what they would shift to was something you could tie back to
like a recent disclosure, a researcher coming out with some new capability. Something
shared on Twitter, and we actually had we have a detailed slide showing kind of a mapping between when something was released and how quickly it was adopted, and it's an interesting data point.
And the point here isn't that sharing things on Twitter is bad or wrong. The point is that intrusion operators are following and tracking the research community. They're paying attention, and they're incorporating those things, either tooling or TTPs, into their attack lifecycle to either do detection evasion or to help further their operations.
Yes. And so an example of them just paying attention, to certainly not suggest that Twitter is the problem here or certain behavior from anyone on Twitter. We have this quick example of APT32. We had this intrusion where they were deploying Cobalt Strike, I think the trial version of it, on a bunch of systems, and we couldn't figure out how it was that was being deployed. And it turned out that they were compromising a victim's McAfee EPO server to push out this Cobalt Strike to all these systems. And we actually hadn't seen that done before.
I don't think we have seen anybody else do it either.
We haven't really seen anyone else do it. I think this is like the example that's in MITRE ATT&CK as the only one, like a tweet with a screenshot about this or something. But it was kind of cool because, again, they were paying a lot of attention. We were able to connect it to this really interesting offensive security research project that was released, was it?
A while back, yeah, right?
Yeah, years prior, about just a weakness in EPO that they seem to use and then kind of update and abuse for this. So it actually used a lot of the same exact packaging and everything like that. So one of the other things we did is we tried to tailor and discuss some of the kinds of things that that some of these groups do that is more relevant for that cyber warcon audience. And there was a lot of talks that day about information operations. It's something I thought was really interesting. I know very little about personally. But so we tried to pepper in some of these. So we included a reference to APT32 doing this other category of information operations. We hadn't really talked about that before, but we let people know that there was at least one intrusion where APT32 took some material from a victim and
released it publicly to
it was released
shape
publicly.
Public discourse within the country.
Yeah, so stuff taken from a corporate compromise for the purposes of an audit was released to shift how people thought about it. So yeah, we're not talking about what they've said, the information operations on Twitter, what they've said about any of us, although that's definitely interesting. And by the way, Saigon Seamus, shout out. I think he's back under a different account, so we tracked him down again. But hey, how's it going?
All right, so we're gonna move on. We moved on to one of the big things that actually Nick and I both worked on in previous years was an intrusion investigation where we saw an ICS cyber weapon deployed, and so there's referred to in different ways. Hatman's actually my favorite in terms of what DHS called it, but we called it Triton, and it's also been referred to as Trisis. So confusing soup of names. So if you look at the threat actors behind it, the bulk of the tooling that they used, if you look at the intrusion lifecycle, the first 80 or 90% of it was all either freely available tools, whether it's a P-Link based backdoor or Bitvise or one of those other ones like that, or Redsourced tooling. And then kind of in the later phases of the attack lifecycle, as they were needing to kind of pivot through the victim's network and ultimately deploy their destructive, or in this case, attempting to cause a shutdown of a safety instrumented system, that was all custom. But the bulk of what they did through the intrusion, most of it was not custom. And so when you look at kind of the spectrum, they blended both, publicly available tools, Redsourced tools, and custom. And this should be kind of a trend that you'd see across multiple of these groups.
Yep.
So.
And I'm actually looking at the Redsourced tools in this particular example. If you can see it, I believe it's interesting to look at the employment history of the people that released it all. So it's an interesting thing that we're going to further explore here with some other tradecraft they conducted.
So one of the cool parts was, a security company called Cybellum had actually released a report, and in this case, I remember reading the report. It was called Double Agent, but the report was actually mostly focused on, how you could target antivirus or security software, and more of a vulnerability on that side. But kind of tucked into that research report was a brand new persistence mechanism that I actually hadn't seen before, wasn't familiar with, and it relies on similar to what you would see with a registry key for. That you would apply to like a debugger on a particular executable. In this case, you actually set what's called a verifier DLL. And so within 6 weeks, from when this blog was released, we saw this particular threat actor pick up that piece of tradecraft within 6 weeks and actually deploy it here in this particular victim environment to try and help not get detected.
Yep. We should ping Hexacorn on that because I don't think he has like every other persistence mechanism, but that was a one that was new to us that we didn't find tied to anything else just on this blog. So then we talked a little bit about APT33 specifically and how they were really able to level up their game in some ways that are correlated and are them as a threat actor are tied to conducting they have connections to destructive malware. So this was pretty impactful and interesting to look at. I think they're the best example as a group that just rolls through.
They throw
public
out new
tooling.
backdoor frameworks. Like they roll a new one. Like it feels like every single week.
Yeah, and just this morning, actually, some more Posh C2 we were looking through. And so we've been pretty vocal about how much they've gotten that lift and how they just keep moving through it. But if you look at them, like, I don't know, we first released some of the report on them 4 years ago versus where they're at now, that adoption has been very successful for them, that reliance on red sourcing.
And yeah, and keep in mind this graph. We picked certain intrusion campaigns on purpose. So this is from
this is from the Overruled
This
blog.
is from the Overruled blog. But as opposed to the intrusion operator and kind of how they acted over time, we decided to kind of pick like point in time snapshots showing the variety of tooling they might have used in particular intrusion. And so,
and this one, I'm glad you mentioned that because the blog Overruled and Ruler specifically, we call out a lot here, and that's such a perfect example of. We're not saying anyone's being like irresponsible, and it's not our place to really chime in on that. Like the SensePost team that put out the tool, we've continued to say in all of our blogs and everything I've referenced about it, like they responsibly disclosed all of this stuff and bring these tools up that are used for a lot of good. And then
they released detection guidance for it, right?
A not ruler tool to assist, and we try to link to all that stuff. But it's just what we're observing that these tools are continued to be used by these attackers, and specifically homepage. And so we went out of our way too to let people know, like, it's not just us that's suggesting this, right? So Cyber Command back in I think July of 2019 shared out with their VirusTotal account, shared out some APT33
usage
homepage
of that CVE, right?
CVE 2017-11774. I know that.
Yeah, you know it's bad when it's
too
like
well
burned in your memory. Right?
because we actually released this week. We released a blog 2 days ago. I'm a little bit out of sleep from writing that one late with Matthew McWhirt and Doug Beanstalk on some effective mitigations for Ruler homepage. We've just seen people run rampant with using the Outlook's homepage client-side exploit without any effective way of stopping it. And actually, that blog we talked about people reversing the patch and being able to continue to conduct this. So we gave some remediation guidance in a way that we believe can't be evaded, and we put a lot of work into that. So we'd love to hear if people are able to evade it.
So a couple of points. Let's say you send a spear phishing email to a victim, and you want to use homepage persistence. You can't do it just by default. The user has to click enable macros. They have to take some sort of action. But once they've taken that action, the registry keys, which are set either by the patch or by the default install of newer versions of Outlook, can be rolled back once you have enabled macros. And so, if you don't do that, then it's not relevant, in terms of clicking enable macros. But the whole point of this is like there are other potential mitigations that we released where you can make it so that these registry keys can't be rolled back or they can't be changed.
Yep.
Using a GPO.
Yeah, and so honestly, the high-level takeaway from this is that just if people didn't know, you could roll this back once you have access to the registry. Of course, there's a number of things you can do post-compromise if you get access to a system. However,
you don't need to be a privileged user on that system to roll it back either.
Exactly. However, it's just basic privileges, but also it's a technique where you literally just persist with a registry key that's set, and then everything is spawned from Outlook. It looks very confusing. There's a number of reasons why it's a little bit more dangerous and effective, and we've seen more people use it. And we actually, in the blog, we went through an example of really cool UNC 1194 sample, which is Trusted Sex Red Team, and they seem to conduct full intrusions using just this technique and remotely swapping out that payload for each stage of the compromise. So it's just.
Do you want to walk through they used Azure Storage Blobs? Do you want to give them a brief overview of what that is or how that works or?
Yeah, so it's all in the blog. It's linked. But they do a lot of creative stuff using legitimate services and things that look like legitimate domains. A couple for Microsoft specifically, they use Microsoft Office
Azure
Fish
Edge.
for an Outlook exploit for payloads hosted in Azure that the payload did domain fronting against Azure Web Service stuff. So it was very Microsoft focused, but really interesting because it was it's all masquerading as legitimate infrastructure stuff. And check out the blog for a little bit more, to be honest.
Yeah, and one other, I guess, key point in this, and we've actually heard since we've published a blog, we've actually heard some feedback from different security teams that when they talked to their IT team, the IT team said, "Hey, we use Office 365, we're not vulnerable." And
because we listed the Outlook, it is an Outlook client attack, and so we listed the versions of Outlook and the hot patch for that.
And so when you use Office 365, you run a different version, but those versions are also, I don't know if vulnerable is the right term, but
yeah, we actually don't know. We'd love someone from MSRC to tell us.
Is it technically the same CVE?
You can override the same registry key that allows you to do this, and it's the Office click to run versions as opposed to a particular Outlook version. So basically, it's not actually the CVE, we don't think, but the point is they're still vulnerable to homepage persistence in this attack if you were to lock down the registry with GPO.
Right, and if you work for a security team and your IT team comes back and says, "We got this under control," or "It's not relevant," you can go back to them and say, "Yeah, actually, it is relevant."
Don't over-focus on the CVE because you might not be vulnerable to the CVE, but vulnerable to this kind of attack. Yeah. Make sense? Kind of. Cool. What else did we talk about?
All right, so topic near and dear to our heart is Russian espionage. We've actually talked in previous episodes, State of the Hack, we've talked about APT28's close access operation. So,
this whole category of what we're saying, bad attribution, the use of red sourcing for bad attribution. Do you want to?
So there's a trend that we've seen actually, especially with the more sophisticated threat actors, which is especially in the early phases of the attack lifecycle, like phishing campaigns or et cetera, is to use red source tooling as a way to make it more difficult to determine or do attribution of who's behind a particular attack.
Yeah, and lower their exposure to their tooling being burned.
Right. And so, because frankly, no one wants their really custom hot tool or backdoor or whatever or update to be burned or available. So if you use red source tooling at the beginning, you can then swap it out once it's successfully lands on an endpoint with something more custom. And so 28, we talked about on previous episodes where in the hospitality industry they did close access operations, meaning they had people physically present on, say, hospitality company's Wi-Fi network.
When, say, there was an interesting meetings
group
going
of people
on
that
there.
were there, right? And used, in this case, Responder, which is a publicly available tool that can basically get password hashes from users that you can
everybody remembered the indictments and the pictures. This one we had here, and actually probably a bunch of red teamers have laughed at the quality of the particular kit in this trunk. But it's just interesting that APT28 specifically was using Responder, and we responded to that and had put out a blog post about how they were conducting these operations against the hospitality industry prior to the indictments. But just kind of interesting, I think that's gotten lost somewhere in that APT28 story that they are also red sourcing in that way.
And then we've got 29 in a pretty broad phishing campaign that we observed using Cobalt Strike. In this case, I think it was a licensed version of Cobalt Strike that they used against a variety of victims, and we think in part that using that to try and help make attribution more difficult.
I will say, because you mentioned the license status, we can get into this in a second, but I really think that the Cobalt Strike model and the control on it and the licensing structure is the way to go. So it's hard because APT29, in my opinion, are the apex threat actor, and in this case, they're this nuanced example of using and doing all of this work and really difficult work to evade all the controls in place to look like a red teaming company, right? They wanted to be underestimated. They used a GitHub a Pandora C2 profile, but not the one available for a trial version. They wanted to look like they were using the trial version, but it was just slightly tweaked and modified to evade those detections. So it's kind of this different class of attackers that's attempting to look like they're red sourcing with publicly available stuff. And anyway, it's just really fascinating. The point is, all people are using these tools not because they don't have anything that would work. They're using them for these other reasons. Yeah, so I think, and this is what we tried to summarize for that audience, was that the incorrect takeaway for this presentation is that red team research is somehow a problem. And me personally, when I got some follow-up on this, people that weren't there, I think it can easily be taken that my position, or a company position, which is certainly not the case, is that there's an issue with red team research. In fact, like, we have a bunch of red teamers we work with regularly and literally working on our team. Not the case at all. The correct takeaway is that it's valuable for threat intel people, for detection teams, everyone to keep current on red team tools and research. And the reason is, like, focusing your detection and collection efforts there and identifying that infrastructure in C2 early has a really high threat density, to use I think it's a Steve Miller phrase, or Matt Berninger, one of those guys. We talk a lot about threat density, and that is a really great place to look, and you're going to find a lot of intrusion operators.
And some will be authorized and some will be unauthorized, but you'll get lots of targeted attacks by focusing on those red team and red source tools.
And that's a part of what the offensive security teams are saying, which is that, don't you like that this is an area you can focus on and you get high return? So that's certainly valid with what we're seeing.
So one of the key takeaways for us was that it's really important, and I feel like I've said this kind of ad nauseum on the show, that it's really important to decouple someone who's using a particular tool from doing attribution of who's behind that. In some cases you can do that, but I'd say it's more the exception than the rule. But especially with red source tooling, that's really challenging.
Yeah, our rule about Carbonac group and not naming groups after malware and clustering them that way certainly applies for red teaming tools. And
but also don't just assume that because you see a red team or red source tool leverage an environment that it is from a red team, or that it's not from a targeted threat actor,
or that it was relied on, that they're not sophisticated because they don't have a thing, because that might be coming, or if the red source tool works, they don't need to drop it.
Right. So.
And then in the presentation, we just gave a list of reference material. There's a lot of people that have asked for various examples, and it's not perfect. We have a lot more telemetry, a lot more we'd like to share, but for each of the examples we provided in the presentation, provided some links, and we'll share those out after this episode as well if people are interested. But specifically for this, back to our sweet, sweet Santa gift, you're welcome.
Is it like 1997 or something like that? Like
first Google result. It was cool. We just wanted to give a little bit more context, because that was a lightning talk, was super compressed at CyberWarCon. One of the things that we wanted to get into, but I don't even really know how to broach and would love some follow-on discussion on, is whether or not a offensive security tool or any kind of intrusion tooling can even be private, can be controlled. And I think there's a couple examples. I'll start. I mean, we talked to Benjamin Delpy on a previous episode. It was awesome talking to him and hearing his defensive-minded approach to things. And we didn't get into it on the episode, but it's worth learning about sort of his Evil Maid attack and how Mimikatz was originally released, and his travel to Russia to speak at a conference about it. And somebody wanted that tool, and so out of safety, right? It's like they entered his hotel room, and out of safety, he released the tool. So it's an interesting example of saying, let's keep this thing in-house, let's keep it custom. Well, can you really completely? That's not to justify any other action, just looking at the piece of information. I think it's an interesting example of, can you do this? And I know there was some other more recent examples on the APT side.
Right. So if you remember last year, we did a predictions episode, and I was going back and listening to some things recently, and I actually picked up on one of my predictions from last year was that in 2019 we would see targeted threat actors basically trying to emulate more closely another threat actor to throw off attribution. Ooh. And so I love the NCSC and NSA joint report where Turla had basically co-opted APT34, which is Iran, and their tooling, and not only their tooling but their infrastructure. So they had basically.
So you're to blame for that. Sounds like you predicted it.
No. Sure. So but the report's really cool because it showed that they were, they had some kind of prior knowledge probably. They were, Turla was scanning for infrastructure, in this case like web shells that were deployed at victim networks, and then, leveraging and compromising those, as well as breaking into their command and control servers and their operational infrastructure, and either deploying, I think if I read the report correctly, their own backdoors under those systems to access them, stealing keylog files and output files, tasking their C2 infrastructure to deploy turtlet-based tooling, and so even co-opting, getting like the source code to some of their backdoors and compiling new builds of it that could connect to different infrastructure and deploying that. So
well-resourced attackers, in this case, even APT34, believing they had a custom tool set, and that maybe not even being possible, right? So I don't know. Extrapolating on that, we won't get into insider threats at red teaming companies that go custom. There's a whole other range of things to think about from it, but it certainly has been in the back of our minds about when people start asking about a solution or what makes sense. And again, I would just underscore that although we referenced a really niche, really interesting example of APT29 there, that one of the models that I'm observing that works well and have certainly come around on is the licensing model, like kind of commercial, legit licensing model, and how much work goes into that. It's not easy to do, but using that to control tooling, and it certainly provides defenders, and there's a on the OffSec side, they're able to work with law enforcement and stuff like that for abuse, and I think that's an area we don't always have visibility into follow-up action on as well. So, as far as I know, that's one of the better things, and are we going to do predictions for this year, or just what's your prediction for next year? You want to make it true?
Anyone?
Oh, okay. Let's see. Predictions for next year. Oh, offensive security is going to come to love Andrew Thompson's Twitter account.
And my prediction will be equally dubious. Red sourcing is a trend that's here to stay. I don't see it going away. It's just
a reality.
Yeah,
makes sense.
It is perfectly logical why threat actors are leveraging very highly advanced tools and capabilities to further things. It's all about resource efficiency, and it's a trend that's here to stay.
Yeah, I would love to see the blue team side, honestly, work with the red team side a little bit more to understand usage prior to release, but also to actually literally help with that portion that people ask for, like some of the defense mechanisms. Some people say like, oh, you should release defensive mechanisms along with this. And in some cases, I think people don't know how to do some of that. And there's a lot of room for collaboration up front to be involved in that, to help on it. And like, I'm offering up my help. I can't offer up company resources, but to try to assist and see what we can work on prior to release, at least.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is if you're a red teamer, you may be really advanced or really great at your tradecraft, but that doesn't mean that you have the experience or the telemetry or to know like what is a good detection or not, and how to do that. So
yep.
That's where...
Same goes the other way.
Absolutely.
You don't want me red team. Sweet.
Cool. Well, I guess we'll look forward to season 3 next year, and happy holidays.
Christmas party time.
All right.
See you guys out there.
Cheers.